Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome everyone to this session number 16, entitled Nature and New Frontiers, Building Resilience at the One World Seminar in the context of the New Heritage Approach topic of the Our World Heritage Initiative. My name is Bruno Coutinho, and I will coordinate this session. I'm a biologist by formation and geographer by deformation. I'm a doctor in geography, and now I'm a director of knowledge management at Conservation International Brazil. I'm grateful to the organization of the event, especially to Professors Mônica Schli from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and also Daniele Pini from University of Ferrara, Italy, who guided us in the construction of this section. So I'm also very grateful to fellow panelists, my friends Rachel Golden Kroner, Siju Kim, and Cândido Pastor, who agreed to share their knowledge in this important discussion on new approaches to World Heritage. Before introducing them and the session, I want to express my solidarity with the families and friends of nearly 4 million deaths by COVID-19 worldwide, and for the nearly 500,000 deaths in my country. I hope we can vaccinate the population and generate an inclusive and sustainable recovery with social justice and poverty eradication. So, Our World Heritage is an open initiative of concerned citizens and organizations that have come together to rethink and re-envision the World Heritage Convention. It's interesting in engaging civil society with World Heritage sites and reaffirm the original spirit of the World Heritage Convention. The initiative aims to protect heritage, support science-based decision-making, stop politicization, and engage civil society. Our World Heritage will also be calling on the responsibilities of state parts as well as of public and private actors to respect the spirit of the World Heritage Convention. The new heritage approach topic should inquire why and for whom the heritage sites are designated, providing meaningful narratives for the user to ensure their preservation. Gender ethnicity, race, and income are key aspects of diversity and inequality in the current geopolitical context to be considered. Our session, Nature and New Frontiers, Building Resilience, aims to discuss what is beyond protected areas and their governance in face of the UNESCO required criteria for recognition of natural, cultural, and mixed World Heritage sites. From this perspective, the session intends to discussing living cultural and natural heritage linkage and the uncertainty of the permanence of these areas as World Heritage. We will start the discussion with the concept of BPAs, Beyond Protected Areas, with Siju Kim. She's a PhD student at the Department of Geography at the University of Humboldt in Berlin, and she will bring us an unpublished study on the importance of recognition different types of area-based conservation of nature beyond protected areas, recognizing diversity area-based conservation of nature. So next, Rachel Golden Kroner is an environmental governance fellow at Conservation International. She will bring the concepts of PADDD, protect the area downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement, and the PADD events as a threat to iconic protected areas, and the implication of impermanence for World Heritage sites. And finally, Cândido Pastor, Senior Director of our Future Forests Amazonia Verde project at CI, Conservation International, will close the session with the importance of indigenous territories for the maintenance of biocultural diversity and relations with mixed World Heritage sites with alive cultural and biodiversity. So thank you all. I invite Siju for a brief personal introduction and panel presentation titled Beyond Protected Areas, Recognized Diversity Area-Based Conservation of Nature. Thanks, Siju.
Thank you, Bruno, for the great introduction. Let me put on my slides. Second. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Nice. Yeah, so my name is Su Yuqing. I am currently a PhD student at Humboldt University of Berlin. But before I started my PhD, I worked with Conservation International for a few years. And the study I presented today is a collaboration with many colleagues here and across the Conservation International and beyond Conservation International, that we try to look at what are all the area-based conservation beyond protected areas, and what's the implication of recognizing these diverse approaches. So as we all have known that the traditional way of conservation focused primarily on protected areas, and so far we have made very good achievement to conserve a certain percentage of territories and ocean on our planet. But recently there are also these discussions on when we decide what's the future we would want, if we want to conserve more lands for the biodiversity, have we considered the people living on those lands in these type of plans? And in addition to that, what we want to discuss today is, have we also thought about the fact that some of those people in those planned places you want to protect might have already been doing some sort of biodiversity conservation in some of those areas. And in fact, we actually know that there are many other types of conservation governance going on there beyond protected areas. We know there are indigenous lands, for example, vast indigenous in Brazil, that were actually reported to WDPA as the country's area being conserved. And there are some military grounds, sacred natural sites, conservation concessions, privately protected areas, community protected areas, and there are other payments for ecosystem services, certifications, easement, recreational sites, buffer zones, a ton of things out there already. And in this research, we try to focus on the area-based one, which they have a defined geographical boundary associated with restricted use access within the boundary, and they either have a objective to do conservation, or they have some conservation impacts based on the way the area-based system functions. The question is, although we know these things exist, where are they out there? And what's their relationship with the existing protected areas and all the other places that we think worth conserving for our for the biodiversity of our planet and sustainability and sustainable development and climate change and all the other things. So there are some general implications of them. First, area-based conservation beyond protected areas are very diverse, and they're also dynamic, because unlike protected areas that are designated and are intended to stay forever, whether they are or not, that's another question. The other things we put there, for example, the FSC and some easement, they may increase faster than protected areas over time, but then there are also possibilities that some of them will not last forever. So recognizing this diversity of these areas, we would ask questions on if we think about a world where we conserve a certain part of the lands, which of these things we wanted to count as being conserved based on what criteria and why. And to be able to do that, we propose the first step could be an empirically driven inventory to know the types and extent of these areas, for example, as what we did within the Amazon countries. And if we could extend that type of practice globally, we could have a much better view of which lands have been already sort of conserved, how were they managed, and what the impacts they are. And for science, there are many things the scientists could do to help with the process. For example, we should be able to better describe, explain, and predict the dynamics of each different type of area-based conservation. And with the comprehensive map of what has been there for so long, for how long, it is possible to do a more rigorous analysis of effectiveness of additional conservations. For example, if you put in a protected area somewhere, are you comparing with a place that's not protected at all, or maybe the other place you are comparing with could have already been conserved under some of these area-based conservation beyond protected area, but we didn't know before. And then, because there are so many different approaches on the ground and conducted by many different actors, we want to emphasize it's very important to consider knowledge production in this process. And for conservation policy, we believe that if we can actually have this comprehensive atlas of area-based conservation, it would be possible to inform the policymakers to set more appropriate targets in terms of how much land you actually want to conserve, where, what extent is possible. And it is possible based on what sort of criteria and based on working with how many people. And then it also enables the policymakers to think better with where and how to invest, and with more consideration of non-state actors and non-state initiative. We hope it would also improve the transparency and accountability, especially with country reporting the area protected within their territory. We get a clear understanding of what was included. Are there actually more initiatives being created, or are they just, are they recognizing existing area-based conservation approaches? Then all these things adding together hopefully will help to help us to have more adaptive and evidence-based policy. So this part was mainly about the previous part was mainly about the research we have doing with all type of conservation implications in mind. And because of this topic of today's discussion, I want to add a little bit on what's the implications for the World Heritages. So I Googled a bit and found a nomination form for World Heritage List, which seems to me to be heavily emphasizing on the public legal side of the conservation. And it emphasized on national park, for example, like state protected area as a criteria of establishing conservation measures on this World Heritage Site, potential World Heritage Site. Then the question would be, if we want to recognize diverse area-based approaches within the World Heritage processes, how do we want to do it? Do we always want to do it through state recognizing this sort of approach first, then through state recognition, the World Heritage Commission can recognize it? Or should the WHC directly recognize all those non-state area-based conservation approaches? Related to that, what are the level of interest and concerns of these other area-based systems? Do they actually want to become World Heritage sites or not? If they want to or not, what are the concerns they may have regarding the regulation, enforcement, or resources? And finally, if we are actually going to that direction, then how can the World Heritage criteria governance mechanisms work better with all these diverse and dynamic systems? So this is my short presentation. I want to take the chance to acknowledge all the people that have worked on this project. Yifan was the co-first author, and thank you all for listening. That was it.
Thank you, Siju. Great presentation. Thank you, Siju. I think that the last question is the key. How can World Heritage mechanism work better with this diverse of BPAs? Thank you so much for the presentation, Siju. Indeed, these areas with diffuse governance or without boundaries recognized by legal instruments make it difficult for them to be recognized as World Heritage as well. But I will leave the questions for the end. And so now I will call Rachel for a brief personal introduction for the presentation of the work titled Protect the Area, Downgrade, Downsize, and the Gazettement as a Threat to Iconic Protected Areas, Implications of Impermanence for World Heritage Sites. Thank you, Siju. Thank you, Rachel.
Sure. Thank you, Bruno. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to Bruno again for organizing the session and the co-panelists. My name is Rachel Golden-Kroner. I have a background in interdisciplinary conservation science. Now I focus more and more on the social sciences at Conservation International as a fellow. And my research has mostly focused on protected areas and understanding the permanence and impermanence of protected areas around the world. I've worked in the United States in the Amazonian context and increasingly in other geographies with this global initiative to understand protected area, downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement. And I'm coming to you from Washington, DC right now. So this piece, I'll give an overview of this concept that we've defined and has evolved over the last almost 10 years to understand impermanence of protected areas. And then I'll highlight a piece that was actually led by Siu, looking at World Heritage Sites, case studies, and then talk about some of the policy implications that this work has, what we're working on, and then kind of look forward to the discussion afterward for further ideas of how we can advance this work in policy. And acknowledging the wonderful co-authors who have contributed to this work as well. So Siu already showed this map, but just to reiterate, we know we have great maps and a lot of evidence to show that protected areas around the world are considered a cornerstone of conservation efforts, have benefits for biodiversity, climate mitigation, adaptation, and when they're well designed and well managed, sustainable development. These benefits, of course, vary a lot, and they're not all perfect. And I think World Heritage is one mechanism to bring into the assessment of protected areas, and of course, increasingly these diverse other mechanisms that can, indigenous lands can be more effective in some cases at reducing deforestation. But just to recognize, we have this global understanding of protected areas historically, and often we start by just looking at the coverage of protected areas over time. They've increased toward the 2020 Aichi targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's future targets that may be set, that will be set later this year, that may be something like 30% of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures by 2030. So usually we just kind of stop here, we just look at the coverage, and we see the net coverage over time. But the point of this research in this talk really is to show that this is not the full picture. This is not the end of the story. This cover from the National Geographic from a few years ago shows a World Heritage Site, Yosemite National Park in the United States, and it summarizes my research. I was amazed to see this, and I use this in all of my talks because it really just sums it up, that a park protected once isn't protected forever, that quote in the bottom. The bottom line, sort of the summary of all of this, is that establishing the protections is just a milestone along the journey, and things can change. So we need to continuously monitor and support conservation areas. Even World Heritage Sites can face threats, their permanence. And so protected areas need ongoing support to ensure they're equitable, effective, durable, providing benefits for the communities, and have that bottom up and top down support, including financial support. So this research kind of came about because colleagues and I were noticing this trend around the world. And these are just some examples of news stories from many different countries, just a few cases where we see in the United States, reductions of national monuments, changes to marine parks in Australia, rollbacks in Brazil. I think this audience will probably be very familiar with this. It's an ongoing topic of debate even just this week. And we see these cases around the world, many different reasons why protected areas may be rolled back. So we created this, and this was developed by Mike Masha and Sharon Paler, this acronym, this term called PAD, Protected Area Downgrading, Downsizing, and Degazettement, to understand legal changes that affect protected areas, three different types of legal changes that alter the restrictions, reduce the size, or eliminate protected areas altogether. So I'll just go through the definitions briefly so we have all of those, we're all on the same page. You may be familiar with this, that IUCN definition of protected areas, which are part of the World Heritage criteria as well. The key here is that the long-term conservation is crucial. The first type of legal change that we track are called downgrades. So these are decreases in legal restrictions on human activities within protected areas. Second, we look at downsizes, which are reductions to the size of the protected area. And third, degazettement. So this may be a new term. To gazette is to establish or set up protections, whereas degazettement is the loss or abolishment or deletion of legal status of a protected area. Yeah, so all together, again, I'll use the acronym moving forward as PAD. This is a global program of work, and we've been looking at a variety of different research questions to understand PAD around the world and its conservation implications. So we look first to collect data where, when, and to understand where, when, and why PAD events have been enacted or proposed, in which countries, to what extent, and the causes. We are also interested in the impacts for ecological systems, forest cover change, carbon, as well as the social impacts. And we're also interested in the risk factors. So what are the different drivers that can lead to the increase in PAD events? Overall, we look globally, and just highlighting briefly the methodology that we take to do this work. We start tracking when the first modern national park was established, which is Yellowstone National Park in 1872. We have standardized approaches to categorize and define and make decisions about potential PAD events. We use a review of spatial data, legal data through online research or desk research, as well as archival research, which is looking through legal documentation in a given country, going through all those old dusty books, and then some crowdsourcing as well, where folks will contribute and then we'll verify those contributions with our standard definitions and decision trees. And overall, it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative data that allows for qualitative and quantitative analyses in combination. The PAD data, you can combine it with others like forests, carbon, socioeconomic, and other data, and answer lots of different interesting research questions. I'll provide just a brief summary of some of the findings that we've found to date, the results, and you can learn more in some of the pieces we've had. A piece in Science 2 years ago, a recent piece in the Protected Planet Report, which was in chapter 2, I believe. We had a piece in there, and then we're finalizing a brand new data release. If you're interested in that, please feel free to email me afterward, and I'm happy to send it to you. So just some high-level summary of the data we've pulled together to date. We started the clock at 1872, so our first PAD event was in 1892. Up to 2020, there have been over 4,300 events enacted, and we know this is a global underestimate. We've only done systematic archival research in about 15 countries, and there's been opportunistic and crowdsourced research in about 65 additional countries. So globally, we know this is an underestimate, but we can still use these data to understand trends around the world. Approximately the size of India has been affected by PAD events, and a lot of the newest cases have been in marine protected areas in Australia, with large-scale downgrades to authorize mining, commercial fishing, and other industrial scale activity. These about 4,300 events have affected about 3,600 protected areas in 74 countries. And as I mentioned, it's an underestimate, but if you look at just the countries where we've systematically done the research, about 18% of the protected areas in that sample have been affected by a PAD event. So it is almost 20%. So it's probably globally between 15 and 20% of sites have been padded at some point in their lives. We can look at the data in different ways. This is from our science paper, and our latest data release will include new data as well from South Africa, new data from Brazil and the United States, Bhutan, and marine protected areas in Australia. This piece is really important. So we break down the data by proximate cause, or the reason that is stated in the legal document as to why it happened. So there's a wide variety of reasons why PAD events can happen. It's most of them, 61%, have been related to industrial scale resource extraction and development. So this is things like infrastructure, mining, oil and gas, industrial agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and industrialization. So that is most of the events around the world. And those have been linked to increases in forest fragmentation, deforestation, carbon emissions, and these kinds of ecological impacts. So those are the cases in blue on the map. A very different and separate group of events are related to local land pressures and land claims. These are of far less concern for conservation. These are related to local use of lands, land claims for indigenous and local communities, local subsistence use of resources. So a completely different category with very low likelihood of having ecological impacts, and may have benefits for the communities and social benefits. So it's very important to emphasize that we look at the data separately for the pink and the blue here on the map. There are a variety of other causes as well, but those are the main categories. We can look at trends. This is a cumulative graph, so it stacks up the events over time and can break them down on the legend there by the type. So all the blue and green are related to those industrial scale causes, and then the pinks are related to those more local scale causes. The key result of this is that most events, about 80%, nearly 80%, were enacted in the last 20 years. So this seems to be an increasing, growing trend. And I alluded to this previously, but this great commentary by Naughton, Treves, and Holland from a commentary to our paper in 2019 emphasized this case of the Cuyabeno Reserve in Ecuador and its history over time, and emphasized that far greater concern should be given to the permanent changes brought by extractive industries in these protected areas. In terms of the World Heritage component, there's a few different things we can contribute here. So I'll summarize a bit of this piece that we had in conservation biology led by CU, looking at iconic protected areas or World Heritage sites. We found overall globally that there were at least 23 enacted and proposed PAD events in World Heritage sites with diverse development pressures. Some were oil and gas, and mostly were oil and gas, some were infrastructure like dams. And we looked into 4 case studies in more detail, but we provide an overview of those 23 cases in the paper. And on our website, which I'll link at the end, we created a story map, which summarizes and gives you a nice visual to summarize this paper. So you can take a tour around the world and visit these parks through this story map with Google Earth. I'll just give briefly a summary of the 4 case studies that we identified as really important. So the first is Yosemite in the United States, and this has a very long history. It was established in 1890 after the eviction of the Ahwahnechee indigenous peoples. The boundaries changed several times. It was reduced. Some of those were reversed, expanded. Right now it is 30% smaller today than it was when it was originally protected. And on the lands that were removed from the protected area and never added back, forest fragmentation is higher on those lands today. There was dam construction as well, the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which was battled by John Muir, but he did not win that battle. Another example is the Arabian Oryx Sanctuary. This was established to protect the Arabian oryx, which was previously extinct in the wild. There was some conflict associated with the designation status of the park, with different approaches and values between conservation folks and scientists and the local peoples over grazing rights and the use of the land. Eventually, the reserve was reduced by 90%. It was renamed the Al-Wasta Wildlife Reserve. Oil development began soon after that downsize, and the site was removed from the UNESCO World Heritage List. Another example is the Yasuni National Park in Ecuador, which is located in the Amazon. It's considered one of the most biodiverse places in the world. Its boundaries have changed several times. It is larger today than it was when it was originally established in 1979 as a national park. Oil development through different blocks has expanded over time, and more oil activity with the associated roads and other development have been a concern and have impacted the local and indigenous communities. And the fourth is Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is the oldest nature reserve in Africa. It's a very challenging context, history, and current situations of armed conflict. There's been a long history of attempts to downgrade the park for oil development as well. So we have these examples, and you can certainly check out more qualitative information in our papers. I did also want to talk a little bit about COVID, because I'm co-chairing a task force through the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas that's focused on COVID. And we've done a lot of work over the last year on this topic of impermanence of protected areas and other environmental laws and budgets during this period of the pandemic. So we found, similar to what we've seen in the past, a lot of different rollbacks or changes to weaken environmental laws going on kind of undercover, when the public is not able to participate or really focus on trying to respond to some of these rollbacks because we're otherwise focusing on the pandemic, of course. So we built a website to aggregate this information on the Conservation International website, which we can we will continue to keep up to date. And also we published a special issue of the journal Parks in March, which looked at the linkages between COVID and protected and conserved areas. So I'm kind of running out of time, but I'm happy to share the link to this after. Yeah, so finally, just to mention what are the implications of all this work for our conservation thinking and how we move this forward in the 21st century. So first of all, I think this research really just challenges the assumption of permanence. And we know that protected areas are not necessarily permanent fixtures on the landscape. This phenomenon of PAD has the potential to, but doesn't necessarily undermine conservation objectives. So it's, again, very important to look at the context of each change and the proximate cause and the associated impacts as well. And with anything, we always need more research and long-term monitoring, including real-time alerts and more capacity to support the local communities around these protected areas. In terms of policy and funding responses, I mentioned at the beginning, protected areas need more support to ensure that they can be effective and equitably managed and have sustainable funding and local engagement and decision-making. For the future, the Convention on Biological Diversity Zero Draft does include PAD as a potential indicator for Target 2. So this could help with global monitoring, tracking, and reporting of PAD events. With respect to processes, not, as I alluded to, PAD events are not necessarily bad. There could be some local support and legitimate reasons to change for land claims and conservation planning, for example. So having processes surrounding these decisions that are transparent, participatory, responsible, accountable, with opportunities for that legitimate participation of communities is going to be crucial. And finally, thinking about various principles from environmental law that could be helpful here. One is parallelism, which is the idea that if you do something, you have the same process for when you undo it. So to establish a protected area and to change a protected area should have the same process. Another concept is non-regression, which is this idea that once you do something, you shouldn't regress, you shouldn't roll back. So that may be a little more difficult in the context of climate change to operationalize, but these principles can be helpful. I'm going to skip this one. I know we're running out of time, but just to quickly say, at CI, not only are we doing lots of research, but also engaging on different fronts to advance this work and support conservation efforts through various channels. So finally, just to plug, padtracker.org is our website, and you can access the data, maps, other resources. And there is a Brazil platform, I know that will be of interest to this audience, which is in Portuguese and has the same data as it's just for Brazil in Portuguese. So thank you to the many collaborators and folks who have contributed to this work over the years and worked on it. This is probably missing lots of people. It's been a huge effort to get to this point. So thanks all, and thanks again for having me. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions, and I can put my name in the chat if needed. Thanks.
Great, Rachel. Thank you. This theme is super actual, and the presentation has a high quality with lots of reference in important academic journals. Thank you. This topic is very important and not everyone knows it. This shows also how national and local policies can be threats to the World Heritage, when in fact the World Heritage title should strengthen nature conservation policy and vice versa. It's impressive the 23 at least PADDs if you put Brazil after 2019, the date of the paper, it will increase for 30. Because we have now PDD in the Foz do Iguaçu National Park. It's a natural heritage. And also in the Paraty and Ilha Grande biodiversity sites, cultural and biodiversity sites. It's a mixed sites recognized in 2019 and highly threatened by PADD events. You know, the Brazilian Cancun projects of our governments now. So the Paraty and Ilha Grande history is very interesting. Initially, as cultural sites, due to its historical and architectural aspects, it never left the tentative list since 19th. When intangible cultural aspects of traditional and indigenous people who lived together in this place were associated with the maintenance of the biodiversity, we were able to create a concept of a living sites with culture and biodiversity in harmony in the landscapes. So following this way of thinking culture and nature living together, I call our friend Cândido Pastor for a brief personal introduction and to talk about the importance of indigenous people and local communities for the maintenance of biocultural diversity and how this can have relation with mixed word sites with alive culture and biodiversity. Thank you, Cândido, for sharing your knowledge with us. Rachel, thank you. The questions I will bring to the final. Thank you, Cândido.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and all. It's so interesting, the connection about cultural nature issue. I think it's the new approach in the last, I don't know, 15 years, 10 years that we are applying for understanding what the conservation and how the climate, Nature for Climate is working. Personally, my name is Cândido Pastor. I am based in Cochabamba, Bolivia. I've been working with local conservation strategies for the last 20 years. And I began, in fact, my career living in an indigenous community that's called San Jose de Chupiamonas in the Madire National Park for 2 years. And I learned a lot about how to differentiate the overlapping of protected area and indigenous territory in this situation. And a lot of learnings during these years. I worked as a technical director for Conservation International Bolivia, creating protected areas, defining business based in nature, and other strategies that we use as a conservationist. And now I'm here working at the Amazon level and the 7 countries where CI has work, and above the 9 countries that are part of the Amazon basin. I don't know if you can see my screen now. I think you have to admit that the possibility to share. Can you share it? Can you see?
Yes.
Thank you. And the first thing that I want to share with you, this is not based in a research, it's based in the years that we are working on indigenous peoples. And of course, also my profile is more like a project manager, project executor, project technician in the field. And that's why it's a little different in terms of the reference, managing the reference in the academic support for that presentation, but it's based also in the revision of some sources that are scientific. And as you can see, this map is prepared by our team here in the Amazon. You can see the areas that are indigenous lands. My first point here is indigenous lands are 25% of the Amazon basin surface. This means that we have a natural ally as a conservationist, as a people that are looking for the sustainability with indigenous peoples. And if you consider these other areas that are not titled yet, in this same area, maybe we will increase more. Nobody knows how much we can increase because the process of titling is so long and sometimes it's tricky, I will say. And just in Suriname, for example, Suriname is a country that not recognize the indigenous rights in terms of titling. And just in the South Suriname, we have the Trio and Guyana. They are asking or claiming around 7 million hectares. Like 2 years ago, the IDSF, that's the main body of indigenous peoples in Peru, showed some data around 20 million pending in Peru. And of course, in Brazil, it's so hard to understand how this process is going on because a lot of political interests are around this process. But seems like titling indigenous territories isn't a good strategy for conservation, for cultural heritage care, for climate stability. It's so clear. If you see the fluxes in terms of CO2 and other gases, you can see that the indigenous peoples are playing a role that's not recognized totally in terms of the climate stability. And something that's important to see in terms of and it's obvious, right? Indigenous territories are not protected areas, but are having a very good impact in terms of conservation biodiversity, conservation of the forest, keep the carbon in place, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe have like the same results, but with other entry point. And in fact, for me, these territories are a biocultural strategy for the life, for sustainability, right? And if we see the same map about the region, you can see that why I titled this presentation as indigenous territories as strongholds, because you can see in this graph, it's so clear. You can see in orange, like orange, the indigenous areas, and you can see how it's happening around. You can see here in Brazil, in Alto Xingu, in Cayapo, indigenous territories, of course, have impacts in terms of the forest coverage inside the territory, but the indigenous territory is working as a stronghold for stopping the deforestation. And also in Bolivia, you can see here as it's not small, it's 500,000 hectares here in Chimán-Moceté that are stopping the growing deforestation in this area. I mean, this is the indigenous Chimán-Moceté area, and around is the deforestation is happening. These kind of pressures are happening, but not just deforestation. I reviewed this morning the prices of the gold mining, and the prices got to the highest point historically in the last 20-30 years, right? And this is something that's impacting. It's not about deforestation, it's about contamination, it's about degradation, it's about losing a cultural capacity to keep the culture intact, etc. In some cases in Peru and Bolivia are important. For example, in the Rio Tuiche River, in the Chupiamona territory, we prepared local ecotourism guides with really high level capacity process. And today, a guide have to decide if have a dedication for gold mining, artisanal gold mining, and gain around $50 in one day, or being a high quality ecotourism guide and gaining around $10, $15. This is the difference. This is the cost benefit, because indigenous peoples also have this in mind, these challenges in terms that the cost benefit is there. I mean, it is happening another kind of drivers of deforestation also, la ganadería or others. And if you can see, I prepared this graph especially because you can see that deforestation is not so high, but it's happening in indigenous territories, but it's not so high. Of course, Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia are the most important ones. If you can see here, Suriname is not part of that graph because the deforestation is not relevant. In fact, Suriname is a big opportunity to keep the forest intact. And it is a country that with low deforestation and the high forest, this is the the idea that we are trying to understand that. But what is happening with the incentives in terms of the international convention and mechanisms? If we are pricing and recognizing and supporting the deforestation areas through REDD+ project, but indigenous territories are keeping the forest intact, are keeping the carbon in place, but the possibility to leverage funds or to support this process are hard in the international arena. And we have to think about what, okay, they are doing a really good job, but they are not receiving the correct incentives, and given that the fluxes also are in favor of indigenous territories, and they are capturing the CO2 in general in the from the atmosphere. You can see the same pattern here that like with the fires, Brazil is the first one, Bolivia is the second one, Peru and Guyana and others are less important, but it's happening. It means that indigenous territories in average have like a 90% in good conservation shape of the territory, and around 9 or 8% degraded, and the rest without forest cover. It means that we have to think, in my view, the indigenous territories in this situation and how to provide incentives to conserve this process is the question of million. What happens if we're losing the forest in terms of losing culture? It's the same. It's the same. I'm showing you this graph. This is indigenous community highlighted in red. In the last 2019 fire season in Bolivia, we lost around 60,000 hectares. It means that they lose around 65% of the entire surface. But where we are losing forest, we are losing the school for the next generation. That's so important, because the elders have the forest to teach the new generations how to manage the forest, how to use the traditional knowledge to hunting, for harvesting, for managing non-timber products, etc. This is what's happening when we lost the cover, forest cover. Is not about nature; it's also about culture. It's the same in the end of the day. Please, Bruno, let me know if I am taking more time that I have.
It's good. Thank you, Cândido. Go ahead.
The other point that I want to highlight, we have a good speech in general in the sustainability world to support indigenous peoples, but we are not open the doors for increasing and to have a real support for indigenous territories and to keep the nature and culture in the same time. One example is the access of environmental funds. I was reviewing some data about the environmental facility, the GEF project is just 5% from the beginning of these mechanisms. It means that in 1991 and some years after, just 5% of the total amount invested went to the indigenous and local communities, including the small small project mechanisms that they have. And this is critical. And also, if you see the indicators of the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, the indicators are deforestation, are not the forest storage, right? The main indicators. I mean, we have some of them, and in the same time, I have to recognize that the consultation process, that's a central piece of the working with indigenous peoples, are increasing, are improving. And one of the most better guidance in terms of this process comes from the Green Climate Fund. It's incredible how, but in the same time, we have a good process in terms of consultation, but low execution in terms of the conservation and culture and nature, right? This is what's happening. And also we have to recognize that the indigenous territories and indigenous organizations have a weak administrative systems that we are not scheduling as a part of the governance process for nature, right? And as I said before, the cost benefit in terms of the cost opportunity is increasing in favor of the other activities that are not sustainable, like the mining and other issues. And what is it for my view and experience? And one thing is important, that all the rights in the Amazon basin are not in the same level of recognition. First, you can see Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela are recognizing the indigenous rights in the constitution level. But Suriname and French Guiana are not recognizing indigenous rights. I mean, are not part of the convention of the ILO Convention 169, are not part of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Declaration of the UN. And but in the same time, all the Amazon basin are having like a different levels of recognition of rights. Automatically, we can't assume that these countries are having the same level of in terms of recognition of rights. And the others, Colombia, Peru, Guyana, recognized in the law, in the national laws, but not at the constitutional level. But in the same time, all these processes that are legal recognition of rights are being violating. I mean, and a half of the environmental defenders in Colombia killed the last 2 years or 3 years were indigenous. It's saying something about the condition that we are, the people that we are in touch for conserving the Amazon, I mean the indigenous peoples. And finally, just to remark how we can do on that. Given that the indigenous territories have a good shape in terms of conservation, in my view, it's important to provide incentives for that, for restoring the areas that are not in a good shape at this moment in terms of conservation, conserving in a traditional way, and also managing. This is a graph that shows and also the needs of monitoring and technologies. At this moment, any indigenous territories have the capacity to monitoring what's happening in the entire land, because are big and the population is low and the capacity is not in place. We need technologies for monitoring what's happening, for providing feedback to decision makers, and also for indigenous peoples to maintain the culture and nature in place. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cândido. Impressed with the thinking of losing forest. It's the same of losing knowledge and culture, specifically in these times, these pandemic times, which a lot of old people in indigenous peoples have, well, dead. And with them, the culture, the traditional oral culture, it's lost also. Well, thank you, Cândido. Your speech shows us that it's imperative to incorporate traditional knowledge into conservation policies. These peoples have already shown us the path we must follow for a sustainable future. We have technologies and even public policy. What is needed is to implement them in the service of environmental justice. So I'm really grateful for you guys. You are amazing. This one CI table was very, very impressive. And I want to congratulate you all for the beautiful work. And the convergence of the presentation is impressive and strengthens the approach of an integrated vision of culture and nature to achieve the sustainable development goals. Well, here we have some guiding questions for the discussion, and I expect that some questions of the audience, but I select some of them and I will direct to you to encourage the discussion. So first, I think that there is something common in the three presentations, and perhaps it's linkage with the recognition, with the laws that supported the BPAs, the PADDs, and the indigenous lands in all these countries that we are discussing. So, Siju, it is clear that BPAs almost never meet the criteria of adequate protection, of the guarantee of integrity of the territory. It involves recognition, delimitation, and governance. However, it seems important to bring the concept to the Heritage Convention, considering that BPAs often have a local management not recognized by public policies. Perhaps this could strengthen future recognition of BPAs as instrument as important as PAs for the conservation of biocultural diversity. What do you think? How can we consider BPAs in the proposal for a new convention of World Heritage? Siju.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not the person in position to answer that question because it really depends on those people who are actually behind all those BPAs. It's up to them. Do they want to have this conservation as one of the major objectives of their lands? Do they want to bring all these extra restrictions, but also potentially extra resources and integrate that as part of their governance of their lands? So I think it's important to start these conversation with those actors, for example, indigenous people mainly, because they are a large part of the BPA, and also other actors, what type of scheme they will find helpful for them to match the incentives with the intentions. And to build the capacity. I think that's an important conversation to start, but it's not up to me to recommend what's the best way to do it.
Clear. Thank you. Rachel, Cândido, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. I love the idea to fit the right intentions with the right incentives. This is something that for me, I want to highlight and take as a base about in terms of the indigenous peoples we need to do, right? We have a good examples in the region. I mean, the Sociobosque project, it's a good example to provide incentive for conservation, not just the nature, also the culture, and other initiatives in Bolivia, for example, Conservo, that had the same scheme of in fact, copy and paste the experience from Ecuador to Bolivia context, but because the political context, it's not working now. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. We have this experience, we have to gather this experience, at least in terms of indigenous peoples. It's like a fertile land to put these seeds of right incentives. I think it's a moment, for example, in a process of restoration. Who knows how to manage the forest are the indigenous peoples. If we have the right incentives, it will work. We don't need another middle organizations to do that. Just the right incentive using the right channel. I think so. I think we can find these kind of examples in the region and replicate this kind of examples.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree with all this. And just to, I think it reemphasizes the importance of diversity. We've had, just reflecting on some recent conversations we had yesterday on diversity, equity, and inclusion and decolonization of conservation. And I see the themes connecting across all of these topics as well. And so just to kind of put that out there that it's resonating for me.
Thanks, guys. Well, Rachel, you have shown us that the natural world heritage sites is often threatened by PADD process. This week, I mentioned before, the construction of a road inside the Foz do Iguaçu National Park, it's a natural world heritage site, is being discussed at the Brazilian National Congress. Do you believe that strengthening heritage education and recognize its benefits to society can reduce the impacts of PADD in these protected areas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm thinking about even a broader question about the processes. So when there is a proposal, or if there is a proposal to downgrade, downsize, or degazette a protected area, what happens next? And it depends on the context of the case in the country. Sometimes there are multiple proposals over time that get that the public will respond to. In something like a World Heritage Site that's so high profile, we haven't looked at this specifically, but I would hypothesize that World Heritage Sites, because of their high profile, have more people know about them more. They've visited them, perhaps. There's going to be a bigger public outcry, more pressure on the politicians and the decision makers to not pursue unsustainable development in a World Heritage Site. So each context is different. We've seen, I'm also reflecting on the current cases in the United States and, Washington, D.C., down the street from me, we have big swings in environmental governance frameworks. So our last president rolled back more environmental protections than any other president in this country. And now we're seeing a big swing in the other direction with the current president reversing and reestablishing protections. So there's this wide polarization. Changes can happen very quickly, including during COVID and after. There's a lot to unpack here. I've been thinking a lot about long-term versus short-term incentives and thinking, a lot of our world, a lot of the way we do things structurally is so short-term. Election cycles, markets, projects are the Jeff projects, they're just a few years, things like that. So there's a lot of just short-term incentives that we all constrained by, but conservation and including things like indigenous wisdom and 7 generations principle, that these long-term thinking ideas are what we need. And I think that the work on impermanence sheds light on this, that we can't take these places for granted. We need to be thinking long-term and connecting back to some of that decolonization, that those learning from indigenous wisdom is I think part of the solution. So your question was more about public education. I think, of course, awareness, public education within World Heritage and in general the value and importance of different conservation areas. During the pandemic, we've seen, at least in the global countries like mine, more visitation to local urban parks, right? And just appreciation of those local benefits. So, it doesn't have to be a World Heritage Site to value it. But yes, I think absolutely education is part of this long-term thinking to resist these short-term incentives that we all face.
Yes, great, Rachel. And thank you to mention that people are frequently with more frequency at the local parks. So we have here in our chat one question that I think that is from Monica. CI is working in a broad global scale, and as far as I understood, we focus on natural protected areas and more recently the role of indigenous areas in conserving these areas. I would like to know if CI has interest in assessing and monitoring cultural protected areas, especially the ones located in urban and metropolitan areas. I mean, the cultural sites threatened by urban expansion process. If you want, Rachel, Cândido. Here in Brazil, we trying to support some local movement, local social movements like the Transcarioca Trail. It's an urban trail inside of Rio de Janeiro. But yes, Monica, I think that we are in a broader scale, but we have some actions. I don't know if Rachel or Cândido or Siju have some examples, or if you can say about our interest in assessing these areas.
It's interesting. I'm not aware of any specific projects, and maybe others are, but in terms of whether something like this could be included in the Beyond Protected Areas framework, it certainly could. So I think the framework that CU highlighted, the idea is to keep it broad and inclusive, and could bring in various types of sites that are closer to urban areas, certainly. But in terms of specific cases, I'm not aware.
Yeah, we have some examples. I think our approach and emphasis in the forest areas that are not the metropolitan areas, but some examples from Colombia, for example, are show us the importance of the water provision for cities, and we are working and monitoring these kind of areas that are sources of water, and this scheme is being replicated in other countries as well, not just as CI and other organizations are working in Ecuador as well in the same scheme to keep the forests that have a function for water sources related to big cities. But in my point of view, is not the main focus. The main focus is the forest in the rural areas.
Good, Cândido. Good to remember the freshwater health index in Colombia. We had applied here in Guandu River Basin in Rio de Janeiro. It's based in supply 10 million people in the metropolitan region. And I think that it's important reference for our audience, the freshwater health index, if you want to Google it, and it's very, very, very important tool for monitoring the health of waters. Cândido, it's clear that IPLCs play a very important role in nature conservation. Faced with so many recent threats to the rights of native peoples, especially here in Brazil, does the worldwide recognition of cultural and natural heritage have the potential to strengthen their culture and resist threats?
Yeah, for sure. It's for me, it's clear when we are speaking in the Amazon about culture, we are speaking about nature. In fact, these words goes together, and the practice in the field are also together. I think as a conservationist and our environmentalist, we always do a little mistake, not a little, depending of the angle, to separate two things. If we are speaking of nature, we are speaking of culture with different elements, but and also we have different entry point, but we arrive in the same room. This is the key aspect, and the same room is it's having emphasis in the field, but also we have to take into account the global pressure of markets, the commodity markets. I want to say this in addition, but it's so important because if just Europe and United States change the laws, the free deforestation consumption, we will change all the Amazon. We will have the Amazon for the humanity forever. You know, this is something that we have to view, not just what we are doing in the field, we have to work in the global markets as well.
Very good, Cândido. In this sense, I have a question for all the panelists. Does the division between culture and nature still make sense for the recognition of World Heritage? Is there a culture without nature and vice versa? I think that Cândido answered this question. But Rachel and Siju.
I totally agree with Candido. This absolutely, and this is interlinked, and this is going back to decolonization. This idea of separating people and nature is just another way of drawing lines and leading to more extractive, hierarchical dominance, those kinds of paradigms, as opposed to this reparative, restorative, connected, we're a part of nature, right? So I've been using the phrase, instead of saying people and nature, I say people and the rest of nature. That's one way I've thought about saying it. I'm sure there are others. This is something that I will admit, I have a sort of Western science background, PhD, and most of my training was this separation, people and nature. But the more I read and talk to people and thinking about the racial justice movement and all these indigenous movements, and the more I learn, I wake up to this, we are part of nature. I think COVID has also illustrated this. Most likely COVID, SARS-CoV-2 and other diseases come from animals into people, and the risk of emergence of zoonoses is increased with more loss of those intact forests and fragmentation. So that's just another illustration of our vulnerability as a humanity, and also the importance of maintaining that intact and reparative and restorative relationship with the rest of nature.
Seiju?
Yeah, that reminded me of today I was just checking the World Heritage site and looking at where are all those things. And from the map, you can see most of the heritage, be it natural or culture, they are mostly in the Europe. So the criteria is probably related to where the whole thing started and what type of world they have in mind when they started all these things. But now it's a global thing now. I think there's definitely some reflections we can have on, if you think about culture and nature and what counts as heritage in the global context, rather than mainly from the European or perspective. I think that would be a very interesting discussion to have, although I don't know who's going to have that discussion. But yes, and I 100% agree with Candido and Rachel.
Very good, my friends. I think that the colonization aspect is a key. In fact, Seiju, I noticed that the most of mixed sites are the cultural was dead. We have only the ruins. How can I say ruínas, Cândido? Save me, please. Ruínas. All the mixed sites are ruínas and biodiversity. The past archaeological and biodiversity.
Yeah, archaeological
something
sites.
Like this, archaeological sites. So it's rare to find mixed sites with people and biodiversity living together. The example of Paraty and Ilha Grande in Brazil, it's very important because just this concept of people and biodiversity living together was the argument for these sites be World Heritage mixed sites. So with this, I have, I think, a last question for everyone. How to narrow the post-pandemic green reconstruction narrative with World Heritage? Strengthening the recognition of alive mixed sites. I personally think I like the concept of mixed sites, but I think that it's necessary to broader understand this with this kind of view that Cândido puts here. For a lot of indigenous people, nature, it's not a word this nature, this world doesn't exist. It's only people and nature. So I think that mixed sites can put this idea together. What do you think about this?
I mean, may I jump? The post-pandemic situation is like being prophet without enough information, right? It's like, it's really hard to know, but reviewing some tendencies globally, it seems like the demand in terms of the commodities will increase because the countries, at least in this part of the world, are looking for economy recovery. It means that the governments like Brazil or any government are trying to create a packages economically packages for economy recovery. And what's the way that our countries in this region see the recovery is through extractivism. This is something that's not new. And I see some, I mean, it's not the worst case scenario, but we will have a tendency. In fact, we are having, right? If you see the curves in terms of the pandemic situation and the extractive and deforestation and other pressures increased during the pandemic because low control and also the demand is increasing. And seems like we will have like a boon in terms of a lot of money in the market and a lot of demand. It's something that we have to figure out. And it's hard to balance in terms of the investments. You know, I was reviewing some numbers, right? 1 kilometer of pavement in the Amazon cost 15 million in average. One big project for conservation is just 1 kilometer. Yeah, and we have hundreds of kilometers in progress, and we have to to think creatively how to increase the incentives for conservation and also create awareness condition for the politician and politics in general, in my point of view, and continue working, incentivizing the land level in terms of the work that we are doing in different angles in protected areas, indigenous territories, and other schemes of conservation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I've been working on looking at some of this, like the global trends or tendencies associated with economic recovery. In the first 6 months of 6 to 8 months of 2020, we saw a lot of shutdown, that initial phase, and at the same time, rollbacks to environmental protections and budgets in the name or under cover of the pandemic, not allowing people to participate in discussions that they normally might be able to, especially if there's no access to virtual connection. So just dispossession on that side. And then with economic recovery, so much money is being spent all over the world so quickly. And there have been different analyses looking at where is that funding earmarked, where is it going to be going? So we did an analysis in parks that I mentioned, and there was some analyses ongoing by Vivid Economics that have found that more funding has gone to undermine nature, basically, than support it. So subsidies for fossil fuels and industrial scale extractives agriculture. So a lot more funding has gone to those kinds of things than to nature-based solutions or other green incentives. So there's a big imbalance between what the politicians are pledging through things like the Leaders Pledge for Nature, the High Ambition Coalition, all of these recent beautiful words, awesome, but we need to hold these words accountable, these politicians accountable, because the actions and where the funding is actually going is not. There's a gap between the actions and the commitments. So I see that as a role that I've played, that I think civil society can play, and others in our space potentially, that we can just keep an eye on these where is the money actually going or being pledged, as opposed to these high level commitments.
Well, thank you, everyone. We have just two comments here in our chat. One is from Sahid Valda. Just to follow up on Monica's question, there is a case in Cape Town, South Africa, where a floodplain which has indigenous significance, a site of Portuguese colonial defeat and Dutch colonial land conquest, is under threat by developers to put it under a multi-billion-dollar concrete construction. There is a standoff between developers and a coalition of community organizations opposed to these developments. It's an important information. I think that Rachel.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's cases like this all over the world, and we need more case studies of these kinds of contexts. So like our paper looks at a few, the paper I mentioned, but I think we need more case level information to understand how best to respond and counter to these proposals. I think in general, from what I've seen, it's local organizing, community organizations can be really powerful. But it can be a combination of different levers that can be pulled, depending on the context to counter specific things. I'm actually, just on a personal note, in my neighborhood, there's a proposed housing development that would clear cut the last remaining forest of one of the last remaining patches of forest in this county. So I'm involved on a local level, on a personal level with this campaigning. And it's the same kinds of things I see in my research with the public comment process has been curtailed, has not been easy to participate in and things like that. So this is happening everywhere, potentially. So I think it's, using our people power to continue to stay aware and organize.
Thanks, Rachel. Rachel, people can contribute with the PADD platform.
Yeah, I can put the link in the chat so you can access the platform, and feel free to reach out as well.
Great. We have another comment here from Vera Tangari. Vera is a professor here in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you, Vera, for the audience. Hey, we have to remember that UNESCO is an European-centered institution. Yes, we are talking just about this. I think that it's a very good discussion for just to amplify the convention, or the comprehension of the convention. And I really want to take you guys. You are amazing, Cândido, Rachel, and Siju. Thank you a lot. It's enriched our discussion a lot beyond my expectations. Thank you very much. And if you want to make last comments, feel free, please.
Looks like we have another question in the chat.
Oh, yes. Is the problem that we have a fossil fuel-based economy that threatens both humans and other species? Will a post-COVID recovery that continues to be based on this fossil fuel economy ultimately prevents conservation and human life on the planet?
Yes. So I think we talked a lot about area-based conservation in the talks today, right? So protected areas, indigenous lands, and other conservation areas. But of course, this is all part of the broader world outside of these areas in the atmosphere and greenhouse gas emissions, right? So of course, yes, decarbonization first and foremost needs to happen. And so, some countries have pledged and are investing more in renewable energies. In the US right now, there's a debate going on about the infrastructure bill and if there are investments in renewables and the electricity standards. So that's on the table right now. That would be a huge step in the right direction. So yeah, absolutely. We have to get a handle on fossil fuel emissions.
So, my friends, that's it. If you guys want to make the last comments, feel free. If not, please.
From my side, I want to say just thank you, Bruno, and all the organizers, and also Rachel and CU for sharing these interesting approaches and information. And we are here. We will continue here and fighting in favor of the nature and culture together.
Same. Ditto exactly what Candida said. Thank you all.
Yeah, same here. Thank you all. And the funny thing is, while my work with CI is focused on the area-based conservation, my current PhD work and my network was focused on international linkages between European consumption and European investment on conservation and their impact on, for example, South America. So I think that's actually related to many things we discussed today, and what's happening around the world also have an impact in those places that we care about. So it's a really nice discussion and nice to talk to you today.
Very good. Thank you, Siju, Rachel, and Cândido. Now we have another challenge, which is join the network of our World Heritage Initiative with our approach. Thanks to the audience, this session was recorded and can be accessed on the websites at any time. I will summarize our discussion, validate with our panelists for publication and contribution to the initiative. Thank you all. Health for all.